They say every empire is built on blood, ambition, and something far darker that no historian dares to write. Tonight, before we begin, subscribe to History 1, because what you're about to hear is only the first chapter of the most forbidden story in European power. And trust me, you will want to be here for what comes next. Now, let me take you back to a night that scholars pretend never existed. A night when Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who almost ruled all of Europe, stood alone inside a silent chamber beneath the Tuileries palace, whispering to something that was not human. Most people know Napoleon as a brilliant strategist, a genius, a force of nature. But the story that was erased, sealed, and buried under layers of sanitized history is that his meteoric rise was not merely the result of intelligence or luck. It began with a secret pact, sworn in the darkness, witnessed only by walls older than the palace itself. And yes, this is the story of that pact. The year was 1799. Paris vibrated with suspicion and hunger. The revolution had devoured its children, and the Directory, the government that limped on after the Reign of Terror, was collapsing under its own greed. The people screamed for order, the generals whispered of opportunity, and in the candlelit corridors of power, one name began slithering from mouth to mouth: Bonaparte. At 30 years old, he had already become a legend. Victories in Italy, bold campaigns in Egypt, and a mind that moved faster than any army. Yet despite the applause, Napoleon carried a gnawing dread inside him. That fate could turn against him at any moment. He knew that the same crowds that cheered a hero one day could demand his head the next. And he feared something deeper still. A fear born not from the battlefield, but from the stars. He had been obsessed with destiny since he was a child. In Corsica, an old woman, half healer, half oracle, once told him, "You will reach farther than kings, boy, but the higher you climb, the darker the hand that holds your ladder." He never forgot those words, and so, in the late autumn of 1799, as his political ambitions grew too large for earthly guarantees, Napoleon turned toward ancient whispers, rumours spoken by Freemasons, by occultists in crumbling salons, by aristocrats whose bloodlines carried more secrets than titles. Rumours of a force older than Christianity, older than Rome, older than the kings themselves. A force that answered only to those who dared ask. Some called it the Veiled One, some called it the Architect in Shadow, but in the hidden circles of Europe's elite it had another name, Le Sombre Tribunal, the Dark Tribunal. Those who claimed to know of it believed this entity, or entities, did not simply grant power. It demanded something in return. Something only the most desperate or ambitious would pay. Napoleon had become both. On the night of 18th of Brumaire, the night before he would seize control of France in a coup, Napoleon dismissed his guards, sent Josephine away with a hollow excuse, and descended into a restricted section of the Tuileries, a forgotten medieval cellar sealed since the time of the last Valois kings. The key to its iron door had been entrusted only to the most secretive members of the old monarchy, and yet somehow Bonaparte possessed it. Some say Talleyrand gave it to him, others say the key wasn't obtained, but summoned. The room he entered was small, circular, and freezing. The air carried the metallic scent of old relics, objects that had belonged, according to rumour, to King Charles the Stone, the monarch haunted by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. A massacre that some believed had been influenced by a presence only the king could see. In the centre of the room stood a stone altar, smooth as a mirror. Napoleon approached it slowly, each step echoing as if the chamber were a throat-swallowing sound. He held a folded parchment in his hand, covered not in French but in symbols no scholar had ever been able to translate, not publicly at least. With a steadying breath he placed the parchment on the altar and whispered, "I am ready." For a long moment, nothing. Then the candles flickered, the air thickened, and something began to rise, not from the altar but from the shadows behind him. Something that did not walk, but formed. Napoleon did not turn around. He spoke again, more firmly now. "Give me dominion, give me Europe. Grant me a legacy no mortal can erase. In return, take what you will." A voice, deep, layered, echoing with impossible calm, answered, "Very well, Bonaparte. But power purchased in darkness casts a long shadow, and shadows always claim their due, and with that the pact was sealed. What history remembers as genius may have been something else entirely. What followed was no coincidence, and what would one day destroy Napoleon began that night. When Napoleon emerged from the hidden chamber beneath the Tuileries, his expression carried a strange stillness, as though something inside him had shifted. Observers would later say he walked differently after that night, with a confidence bordering on inevitability, as if he already knew the future and merely waited for the world to catch up. But there was something else, too. Something colder. His valet, Constant, would write years later that Napoleon came back to his rooms with his gloves still damp, though the cellar beneath the palace was bone dry. Another servant claimed that the general's boots left faint traces of dust that shimmered like crushed black glass. They cleaned the floor, but the residue returned the next morning, and the next, until winter rains finally washed it away. None of that appeared in the official memoirs, of course. History books prefer clean lines and predictable causes. They don't like intrusions from the impossible. Yet something impossible had followed Napoleon out of that chamber. The very next day, 18, Brumaire, unfolded like a play whose actors already knew their lines. The coup that historians describe as bold or calculated was in truth unnervingly smooth. Generals who had vowed never to betray the Directory suddenly switched allegiance. Legislators who despised Napoleon found themselves paralysed with indecision, and a crowd gathered outside, seemingly sensing that a shift in destiny had already occurred. Even his enemies admitted later that it felt as if an invisible hand was pushing events forward. There is one detail, rarely spoken aloud, passed only through whispers in private archives. Around midday, as Napoleon addressed the Council of Ancients, several witnesses saw the faint outline of a black silhouette standing directly behind him. Though no one stood in that space, some said it was a trick of the light. Others claimed the silhouette moved, shifting slightly whenever Napoleon raised his voice. One council member collapsed, trembling uncontrollably, and resigned his office the very next day. The coup succeeded. Napoleon became first consul, and France, exhausted from bloodshed and chaos, welcomed him like a saviour. But nothing in Europe comes without a cost, especially not power. In the weeks that followed, Napoleon began experiencing vivid dreams. They didn't feel like dreams, however, but visitations. He described them once to Josephine, in a moment of rare vulnerability she never dared repeat publicly. He told her, "Every night I see a doorway. Behind it something waits, watching, measuring me, and when I wake, I feel as though I have forgotten something vital." Josephine, who believed in omens and spirits more than she ever admitted, urged him to sleep with a rosary beneath his pillow. Instead, Napoleon burned the rosary in the fireplace, watching the beads crackle as though offended by their presence. His temper sharpened. His ambition grew teeth. Ministers who questioned him suddenly fell ill or suffered devastating political failures. Generals who resisted him found themselves forgotten, reassigned, or mysteriously disgraced. What looked like strategic brilliance might have been something else, something guiding his hand. And European aristocrats who had studied forbidden texts recognized the signs. They whispered another name, one older than France itself, le spectre couronné, the crowned phantom, an entity said to choose rulers, elevate empires, and devour them when their usefulness ended. A being invoked in ancient rituals by families like the Medicis, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons. Rituals meant not to summon the entity but to keep it asleep. No one had tried to awaken it in centuries, until Napoleon. But one man knew, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, Napoleon's minister, former bishop and quiet collector of occult lore, began to watch the young consul carefully. Talleyrand had once been initiated into a clandestine order in Vienna, where he read fragments of a manuscript called Les 12, Ombre de la Couronne, the 12 Shadows of the Crown. Of the 12 shadows described, one matched what he now saw clinging to Napoleon. The 9th shadow, the one who answers ambition. Talleyrand recognized the symptoms. The sudden bursts of genius, the unnatural luck, the aura of inevitability, and the quiet void behind Napoleon's eyes whenever he believed no one was looking. He became convinced Napoleon had bound himself to a force that no ruler should ever invoke. a force that never granted power freely, a force that always demanded its due. But what terrified Talleyrand most was not that Napoleon had struck a bargain. It was the possibility that Napoleon had not fully understood what he had bargained with, for shadows do not give, they only lend, and behind every loan lies a debt. While Europe celebrated the rise of a new leader, a silent countdown had already begun, a countdown only the darkest few understood. And the entity Napoleon had called from the abyss? It had begun to whisper again, but this time it was giving orders. Napoleon's rise in the months after the coup was unlike anything France had ever seen. It was as though his mind had sharpened to an almost unnatural clarity. His decisions struck with the precision of a blade guided by an unseen hand, cutting through political resistance as effortlessly as a scythe slices wheat. He reorganized the government, rewrote laws, stabilized the currency, restored public order, moves that would normally take years, accomplished in mere weeks. But to those who knew him well, there was something unsettling beneath the surface. He no longer paced restlessly in the evenings as he once did, no longer spoke aloud his worries, his doubts, his frustrations. The man who had always been a storm of thoughts had grown eerily silent inside. Josephine often found him sitting alone at his desk, staring into the darkness of an unlit corner, lips barely moving as if responding to a voice she could not hear. When she asked what troubled him, Napoleon would blink, slowly, as though returning from a distant place, and reply, "Nothing at all. Everything is inevitable." Those who heard that word repeatedly, inevitable, felt a strange chill, as if Napoleon was no longer merely predicting the future, but receiving it. It was around this time that the first signs appeared, small, subtle disturbances that servants whispered about in shaking voices. Mirrors in Napoleon's private chambers began to fog inexplicably, even in cold weather, not with steam, but with a strange mist that crawled across the glass like living smoke. Footsteps could be heard a few seconds after Napoleon walked down the corridor, as though something unseen followed him with a deliberate delay. Dogs in the palace refused to enter the East Wing unless physically dragged inside. Several maids quit after waking in the night to see a tall silhouette standing at the foot of their beds, silent, unmoving, featureless. Napoleon dismissed it all as the fantasies of the weak, but one person did not, Talleyrand. He began documenting every abnormality in a small leather-bound journal, written in a cipher no one else could read. He recorded the time Napoleon spent alone, the nights he left his chambers for reasons he refused to explain. The faint marks, thin, dark, almost like soot, that appeared on his cuffs and collar after these disappearances. He noted that Napoleon never seemed tired anymore, even after working through the night. His eyes, once sharp and restless, now held a strange reflective quality, as though something behind them pulsed with its own intelligence. And there was one more thing. Napoleon's shadow had begun behaving incorrectly. Multiple staff members claimed they saw it linger a fraction of a second longer when he moved. Others swore it sometimes stretched in a direction opposite the source of light. One soldier fainted during guard duty after witnessing Napoleon's shadow snap toward him like a living tendril, before returning to its normal shape. Talleyrand kept all these reports carefully hidden. He knew better than anyone. To accuse a rising ruler of consorting with the supernatural was one thing. To accuse Napoleon was suicide. Still, he feared what would come next. By early 1800, France was thriving again. Roads reopened, trade revived. The people began to worship Napoleon, not as a political figure but as a force of nature. Mothers carried portraits of him. Soldiers stitched his silhouette onto their coats like a talisman against death. But reverence is not the same as safety. One evening, during a reception at the Luxembourg Palace, Napoleon stepped aside from the festivities and walked into a dimly lit hallway. He didn't know Talleyrand was following discreetly behind him. What Talleyrand witnessed became the most disturbing entry in his journal. Napoleon paused near an antique tapestry depicting Charlemagne. The corridor was empty, silent. Then the air shifted, like the pressure dropping before a storm. A shape unfurled behind Napoleon. It was not entirely visible, more a distortion of the air than a body. Tall, narrow, its edges flickered like a flame trapped underwater. Talleyrand felt his breath freeze. The torches along the wall dimmed, shrinking as though shrinking in fear. Napoleon did not turn. He whispered, "Not now. They are watching." The shape rippled and vanished. Talleyrand's knees nearly gave out. His hands trembled so violently he had to grip the wall to steady himself. Because the truth was undeniable. Napoleon was no longer alone. Something walked with him, something that answered when he called, and it was growing stronger. In the weeks that followed, decisions Napoleon made began to feel less like choices and more like commands delivered from some unseen council. He drafted plans for an empire no Frenchman had ever dared imagine. He began gathering symbols, ancient, sigils, coins of forgotten kings, relics stolen from old cathedrals, not for religion, for preparation, for alignment, for obedience. The pact he made in the depths of the Tuileries was no longer dormant. It was awakening, and history was about to become its battlefield. By the spring of 1800, France marched to Napoleon's heartbeat. Factories reopened, armies reorganized, roads stretched out like veins, feeding Paris with grain, gold, and glory. The people hailed him as the saviour of the nation, yet only a handful realized that behind the scenes, a different power had begun guiding his steps. Napoleon's victories, his reforms, his speeches, everything felt too perfect, as though calculated with an intelligence far beyond human limitations. But with each success, the strange phenomena surrounding him increased. Shadows lengthened, rooms grew colder, dreams bled into waking life. And Napoleon had started hearing the voice again. At first it was faint, an echo brushing against the edges of his consciousness. Then it grew clearer, sharper, more intrusive. During council meetings, his ministers sometimes saw him tilt his head slightly, as though listening to someone positioned just behind his shoulder. He would blink, return to the conversation, and speak with sudden, startling conviction, as though replying to a suggestion no one else had heard. What they could not see was the silhouette standing behind him, flickering like a smouldering ember in the darkness. And every day the silhouette grew more defined. The turning point came on May 10th, 1800, when Napoleon prepared his campaign against Austria. While the world believed him simply planning another military stroke of genius, he was secretly awaiting a sign, one given not by generals or scouts, but by the entity that had followed him out of the Tuileries cellar. Late one night, Napoleon dismissed his aides and retreated to his study. The candles burned low, their flames bending toward him rather than rising straight. He stood over a map of Europe, its borders shifting under candlelight like living veins. Then the temperature plummeted. A familiar presence emerged, distorting the air behind him. Napoleon did not look up. "Tell me," he whispered, "which path leads to my crown?" The voice answered, layered, resonant, as though spoken by a choir deep underground. "Toward the Alps, over the ice, toward the nation that resists you still. Dominate Milan, and Europe will kneel." Napoleon closed his eyes. "And what do you expect in return?" The room fell silent. Then the voice replied, "Not yet. For now, only obedience." The candles went out all at once. That very night, Napoleon made his decision. He would lead his army across the treacherous Great St. Bernard Pass, an impossible route few generals would ever dare. His advisers begged him to reconsider. The Austrian defences were strong, the mountains deadly. It was a plan that should have ended in disaster, but Napoleon dismissed their fears with a chilling calm. "Victory is assured," he said. "I have seen the path." It was not boast, it was obedience. And so the army marched, soldiers slipping over frozen cliffs, cannons dragged by ropes through blizzards, horses collapsing from exhaustion. The men whispered that their leader was possessed by a kind of madness. But there was one detail they could not explain. Napoleon never slipped, never faltered, never hesitated. It was as though the ice bent beneath his boots, reshaping itself to allow him passage. Some soldiers swore they saw a towering shadow walking beside him on the ridge, tall, gaunt, flickering like smoke. Others said that whenever Napoleon paused, the wind stopped entirely, as though the mountain itself was waiting for his next step. Days later, against all odds, the French army descended from the pass, intact, ready for battle, and filled with a sense that destiny itself favoured them. Napoleon's triumph at Marengo sealed his reputation as a military genius. But those who studied forbidden law knew better. The ninth shadow, the one who answers ambition, was guiding him now, weaving Europe into a tapestry of conquest. After Marengo, the entity's influence deepened. Napoleon developed an uncanny awareness of events before they happened. He predicted enemy movements with eerie accuracy. He anticipated betrayals before they were made. And servants claimed he sometimes walked through the palace halls murmuring in a language not of this earth. Soft, rhythmic, almost like an incantation learned in a forgotten age. Josephine confronted him once, terrified. "Napoleon, you're changing. There is something with you. I feel it in this house." He stared at her for a long moment, face unreadable. Then he said softly, "I am guided, Josephine, and those who are guided do not fear." She trembled. "And what if the guiding hand does not seek your good?" Napoleon's eyes hardened, cold, reflective, almost metallic. Greatness does not ask whether a force is good or evil, only whether it serves. But while Napoleon embraced the power that followed him, Talleyrand feared it. He had witnessed the apparition in the hallway. He had collected testimonies the emperor would have silenced. He had read the ancient manuscripts that warned, when the ninth shadow clings to a ruler, kingdoms rise like fire and collapse like ash. Talleyrand could not stop Napoleon, but he could prepare, and he began to seek out others, old aristocrats, scholars, adepts of faded orders, those who might understand what had been awakened. For if the ninth shadow had returned, then Europe was not heading toward an age of glory, it was heading toward a reckoning. As Napoleon's power grew, so too did the whispers surrounding him. Whispers that slid through salons, across candlelit tables, and behind the silk curtains of aristocratic apartments. Europe's nobles, those who had survived the revolution, those who clung to their ancient knowledge, began to sense what the common people could not. This was no ordinary rise. This was acceleration, as though time itself bent around him. And the old families knew what that meant. The Rothschilds in Frankfurt, the Orsini remnants in Italy, the forgotten branches of the Habsburg court. They felt the ripple of a force that had not stirred in centuries. Some welcomed it. Some feared it. But all of them understood one chilling truth. When a ruler rises too quickly, too perfectly, too unstoppably, then a shadow walks with him, and shadows do not elevate a man without expecting a return. Meanwhile, inside the Tuileries, Napoleon's transformation continued. His staff began noticing unusual behaviours, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. His sleep patterns changed. Instead of collapsing from exhaustion after long days, he remained awake into the early hours, staring at maps with an expression that seemed almost distant. When he did sleep, it was for moments, not hours, yet he never appeared tired. More disturbing were the episodes that Napoleon himself tried to conceal. Once, Bourrienne, his private secretary, entered the emperor's office unannounced. He found Napoleon standing before a darkened window, unmoving, as though entranced. His reflection looked wrong, elongated, distorted, and its mouth whispered words that Napoleon himself did not speak. Bourrienne backed away quietly, later insisting the reflection continued whispering even after Napoleon turned around. He resigned from his post within the month. Josephine, increasingly frightened by her husband's changes, sought help in secret. She visited fortune-tellers in back alleys, priests who had fled the revolution, healers who dealt in herbs and stars and dreams. One elderly mystic, a woman nearly blind with age, listened to Josephine describe the strange presence that followed Napoleon. When Josephine finished, the mystic went silent for a long time. Then she said, "Your husband is accompanied, but it is no angel, no spirit of protection. It is a watcher of crowns." "A demon?" Josephine whispered. The woman shook her head. "No, a collector." "A collector of what?" Josephine pressed. The old woman leaned forward, voice trembling. "Debts!" Josephine fled the small apartment in tears. She told no one what the woman had said, not even Napoleon, especially not Napoleon. But the fear stayed with her. It grew, it hollowed her, and the palace around her grew colder, darker, more oppressive with each passing day. Napoleon, however, felt none of this fear. Instead, he felt clarity, purpose, momentum. The voice behind him, once a whisper, now spoke with the steady confidence of an advisor, a strategist, a commander. It guided him not only in war but in governance, in negotiation, in the manipulation of men's hearts. During a meeting with his generals, Napoleon suddenly paused mid-sentence, his eyes unfocused. Then he spoke a single sentence that chilled every person in the room. "Europe must be remade. The old order must end. I will be the instrument." It wasn't what he said that terrified them. It was how he said it. Flat, calm, cold, as if reciting something whispered directly into his skull. Murat later confided to Talleyrand, "It was not Napoleon speaking, not completely." This was when Talleyrand made his move. Meeting in secret with a circle of aging nobles, scholars and esotericists, he spread out fragments of manuscripts, stolen pages from suppressed archives, and sketches of symbols carved into relics Napoleon had been collecting. "These are alignments," he explained. "He is preparing something." "What sort of something?" an aristocrat asked. "A coronation," Talleyrand replied, "but not merely political." The room fell silent. One of the elders, Count von Auerbach, a man who had once been part of an occult order in Vienna, ran his finger along a symbol Napoleon had carved into a bronze medallion. "This mark," the Count whispered, paling, "it belongs to the ninth shadow." Another elder looked up sharply. "The one who answers ambition?" "Yes," the Count said, "the shadow that crowns kings and devours empires." A murmur spread through the group. Talleyrand raised his hand. "There is more. This shadow does not serve. It uses. Those who call it believe they hold the reins, but the ninth shadow does not guide. It consumes." "And Napoleon?" someone asked. Talleyrand closed the journal he'd kept since witnessing the apparition in the corridor. "He believes he controls it, but he is mistaken." For the first time in centuries, the guardians of Europe's buried occult knowledge had a reason to reunite. Not to aid Napoleon, not to oppose him, but to prepare for what was coming. Because when a man climbs the ladder of destiny with a shadow holding it steady, the fall, when it comes, is never his alone. Europe would fall with him, and the ninth shadow was already hungry. Napoleon's ascent began to blur the line between triumph and inevitability. By late 1803, he was no longer merely a leader. He was a phenomenon, a force upon which the world seemed to pivot. But with every rising sun, the presence that clung to him grew bolder, less hidden. What had once been an unseen whisper was becoming a companion visible to more than just the frightened servants of the Tuileries. It started with the animals. Stable hands reported that horses panicked whenever Napoleon approached, even when he stood perfectly still. Dogs barked uncontrollably at empty corners of rooms he had just left. A falcon gifted to him by an admirer in Cairo refused food and died within a week of its arrival. The vet swore the bird's eyes were wide with terror, as though something stood before it. Everything instinctual, everything that could sense what humans could not, recoiled from the Emperor. And then came the mirrors. Napoleon had always been indifferent to reflections, but now he had every mirror in his private chambers draped in dark cloth. Servants discovered why when a chambermaid forgot to cover a small mirror above the fireplace. Napoleon walked into the room and froze. The girl followed his gaze and saw it too. In the reflection, Napoleon's shadow did not stand behind him. It stood directly beside him, tall, elongated, its edges sharper than any natural darkness. Napoleon stared at it with an expression the maid would never forget. Terror, awe, and something like recognition. He ripped the mirror from the wall and smashed it against the hearth. The maid was dismissed the next morning. She died 2 months later in an unexplained house fire. Those who knew whispered, "The shadow does not like witnesses." Yet publicly, Napoleon was stronger than ever. France stood behind him. His armies stretched from the sands of Egypt to the heart of Germany. His enemies fell like dominoes, each defeat more improbable than the last. Nations that had resisted France for centuries collapsed under the weight of his advance. Still, Europe's old families remained silent, watching, calculating. Talleyrand knew they were waiting for something, an event, a signal, a moment when Napoleon's path would move from ambition into the realm of the supernatural. He wouldn't have to wait long. In 1804, Napoleon prepared for his coronation. To the public, it was a spectacle of grandeur. gold draperies, orchestras, banners stretching from Notre Dame to the Seine. The people believed they were witnessing the birth of a new era. But behind the scenes, something darker was happening. Napoleon demanded that a series of ancient relics, Roman, Frankish, and even older, be brought to Paris. Items from private collections vanished, purchased or seized without explanation. Monks from forgotten orders were summoned, questioned, and dismissed in silence. And at the centre of it all was a strange artifact uncovered by archaeologists near Ravenna, an obsidian disc engraved with symbols no scholar could translate, except one, Talleyrand. He recognized the symbols from the manuscript Les Deux Ombres de la Couronne. They marked a site of invocation. But the disc had another purpose. It served as a focal point, a lens that drew the attention of the shadow. When Napoleon received the disc, he placed it beside his bed. Servants claimed the temperature of the emperor's chambers dropped instantly, frost forming on the window despite the warmth of the Parisian summer. That night Napoleon did not sleep. He listened, to the whisper, to the promise, to the order. And so came the day, December the 2nd, 1804, the day when Napoleon would crown himself Emperor of the French. The cathedral was crowded with clergy, nobles, and foreign envoys. Pope Pius VII presided, his hands trembling despite his efforts to appear composed. Josephine stood beside Napoleon, pale, as candle wax, her breath shallow. But none of them saw what Talleyrand saw. As Napoleon walked toward the altar, a second figure moved with him, visible only in the periphery of vision, like a tall shadow cast by no light source. Talleyrand felt the air thicken, as though the cathedral's ancient stones strained under an invisible weight. Napoleon lifted the crown. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The torches flickered. The walls seemed to shudder. A cold wind swept through the nave, and then the shadow stood behind Napoleon, full height, unmistakable. It touched his shoulders, not physically, but with a claim. Napoleon placed the crown upon his own head, and every candle in the cathedral dimmed at once. The Pope froze. Josephine swayed. Talleyrand clutched the pew to stay upright. An ancient pact, dormant for centuries, had been renewed in that moment. Not a coronation, a binding. The ninth shadow now had an emperor, and Europe now had a master who was no longer entirely human. From that day forward, the world would see Napoleon's brilliance, but only a few would ever understand the truth. His victories were not the triumphs of a man. They were the footsteps of a force crossing the continent in human shape. And the debt behind that power had only begun to accumulate. No one in Paris ever spoke of it openly, yet the rumour persisted like a stain on the city's conscience, that in the earliest hours of morning, long before the first bells rang, a gathering of France's most powerful men convened not in the chambers of law, but in a vault beneath the city, soundproof, torchlit, and sweltering with a breath of secrets. They called it, in whispers, Le Parlement de Minuit, the Midnight Parliament. And on one frigid night in 1803, mere months before Napoleon crowned himself emperor, this covert assembly gathered for its most consequential meeting yet. The torches hissed against damp stone, robes rustled, boots shifted uneasily. A hush rippled across the chamber when the iron door swung open and Napoleon stepped inside. Not in uniform, but in a heavy black cloak, its collar raised high as if shielding him from unseen winds. The men present, ministers, nobles, financiers, priests, bowed, but their eyes revealed something deeper than respect. They were afraid. Napoleon did not speak at first. He pulled off his gloves slowly, deliberately, as though weighing his next words against eternity. When he finally raised his head, the chamber stiffened. His eyes looked older, as if in the span of a week he had lived a decade. "Messieurs," he said quietly, "France stands on the edge of greatness, yet greatness requires unusual foundations." A murmur of tension moved through the room. Minister Talleyrand, ever poised, ever serpentine, stepped forward with a faint, unreadable smile. "General Bonaparte," he said, "your message was brief. You summoned us at an hour reserved for spirits and confessions. What matter is so urgent it cannot wait for daylight?" Napoleon scanned the room. Then, unexpectedly, he turned toward the far end of the chamber, where a hooded figure stood motionless between two torches. The nobles exchanged uneasy glances. This figure had not been announced, had not entered with Napoleon, had not entered at all. It was simply there, as if it had been waiting long before any mortal arrived. "I present to you," Napoleon said, "an emissary of the ancient custodians of Europe." The torchlight dimmed suddenly, unnaturally, as if dozens of unseen hands pinched the flames lower. Someone inhaled sharply. Another crossed himself. Talleyrand's smile twitched, only for a moment. "The custodians," whispered Archbishop Fesch, Napoleon's uncle. "Surely you do not mean—" "I do," Napoleon replied. For centuries, certain aristocratic families had been rumoured to consult shadowy advisers, beings said to appear only during moments of historical fracture. The plague of 1348, the fall of Constantinople, the burning of the Templars, and the crowning of Charles V. Whether these advisers were mystical, demonic, or simply very ancient humans remained disputed, but their existence was not among those in this room. The hooded figure stepped forward. Its movements were slow, fluid, almost soundless. When it spoke, its voice seemed to bypass the ears entirely, vibrating directly into the skull. "Europe is shifting," it said. "The age of old crowns is ending. A new emperor rises, but he must be forged. Not elected, not born. Forged." Talleyrand swallowed hard. Napoleon stood taller, as if absorbing strength from the entity beside him. "My ambition," Napoleon said, "must go beyond France, beyond Italy, beyond what mortal advisers can plan." He turned to the assembly, his voice sharp. "I require your allegiance as never before. But tonight, you will swear it not only to me, but to the force that has chosen to endorse my destiny." A wave of panic rolled through the chamber. One of the nobles in the back, a portly duke whose titles outnumbered his virtues, cried out, "This is madness! France will not kneel to a phantom." Napoleon's gaze snapped to him, cold, surgical. "It is not France that kneels," he said. "It is you." The hooded figure raised a hand, and the torches flickered wildly. The air thickened until every man in the chamber felt it pressing on his lungs, a physical weight, like invisible hands gripping his chest. Several noblemen sank to their knees involuntarily. A few tried to stand firm, but their legs trembled violently. Only Talleyrand remained upright, barely, but even he swayed, as if balancing on a ship's deck in storm winds. The figure spoke again. "You have been summoned to witness a pact that will carve a new continent from the skeleton of the old, an empire not merely of land, but of will." Napoleon extended his hand, not to the men, not to France, but to the shadow, and the shadow took it. It felt like the room dropped several feet, as though the earth itself recoiled. A pulse of cold swept through the chamber, extinguishing half the torches instantly. The remaining flames burned green. Someone screamed. Napoleon did not flinch. "We are agreed," the figure whispered, and then, without movement, without transition, it was gone. Not vanished, not departed, simply not there, as though it had never existed at all. Silence held the room hostage. Napoleon turned back to the assembly, eyes blazing with a terrifying clarity. "Gentlemen, the empire begins now." He walked out, leaving the midnight parliament frozen, breathless, and forever altered. At last, Talleyrand exhaled a long, trembling breath. "God help Europe," he whispered, "or whatever power now governs it." He was right to be afraid, for the pact was sealed, and the price would soon reveal itself. Long after Napoleon left the chamber of the midnight parliament, the torches still burned with an unnatural green hue, refusing to return to their ordinary light. The nobles lingered, stunned, as if waking from a nightmare that clung to their senses. Some vomited from terror, others prayed, mumbling broken Latin. A few simply stared at the stone floor, refusing to lift their eyes, afraid they might still see the hooded figure standing among them. But Talleyrand, always calculating, always alert, left quietly. He made his way through the underground corridors, cane tapping softly. His composure was legendary, but tonight his hands trembled. The air felt wrong, charged with a pressure he had only felt once before, many years ago, in his youth. He had believed that memory suppressed, but now it clawed its way back, the same presence, The same cold, the same unnatural dimming of the world around him. There was no doubt. Napoleon's emissary was not new. It was ancient, and it belonged to a lineage of beings whispered about in secret halls across Europe. The bloodline of shadows, families of impossible age, custodians of knowledge predating kingdoms, beings who intervened only when history reached a breaking point. No single name bound them, but among scholars who dared research forbidden texts, they were sometimes called umbre custodes, guardians of the shadow. Talleyrand reached his carriage, but before climbing inside he looked up at the moon. A thin crescent, pale and watching. He muttered a quiet curse. Napoleon has no idea what he has touched. But he was wrong. Napoleon knew exactly what he had touched. Across the city, inside the Tuileries palace, Napoleon sat alone at a massive oak table. In front of him lay an artifact he had kept hidden for years, long before he ever sought an audience with the shadow. It was a map, but no ordinary one. Drawn on what resembled cured skin, too smooth, too pale, it contained markings that shifted whenever one blinked, lines that seemed to slither, continents subtly reshaping, themselves as if time and geography were only suggestions. The map whispered softly, not in French, not in Italian, but in a language that existed before language. The Whispering Map. He had stolen it years earlier during the Egyptian campaign, from a sealed chamber so deep beneath the desert that the air had tasted of death. No scholar had been able to read it. No priest had dared touch it. But the shadow had recognized it. Not only recognized it, claimed it. Napoleon placed his hand over Europe. The skin of the map warmed beneath his palm, rippling as though something beneath its surface moved to greet him. "The world is ready," he whispered. The map whispered back. 3 thrones must fall. Napoleon breathed out slowly. The thrones of Europe, the old dynasties, the houses whose power had stretched back centuries, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and perhaps even the British crown. He lifted his hand. The map shifted again, revealing new symbols, spirals, runes, and the unmistakable shape of an eye. Not a human eye, something older, something that watched. Napoleon traced the shape with a fingertip. "You promised clarity," he murmured. "You promised power beyond mortal vision." The room dimmed, though no curtains moved. The flames of the candles bent inward, as if bowing. A voice, thin as silk, sharp as glass, whispered from behind him. "You were given clarity." Napoleon did not startle. He did not turn. "Then show me my next step," he said. The air thickened. The whispering map pulsed. The shape of Europe shifted, France swelling like a golden furnace, illumination spreading outward in sharp, radiant lines. But just beyond its borders, clouds gathered. Dark, heavy, swirling violently like a storm desperate to break free. And inside the storm a symbol appeared. A sigil Napoleon had seen only once before, when the hooded figure touched his hand, the dark force's mark. The map showed its meaning now, a warning. Empires forged by shadow are consumed by it. For the first time, Napoleon hesitated. The hooded figure materialized beside him, not materializing through the door or from the shadows, but emerging from the air itself as though stepping through the membrane of another world. "You doubt," it said. Napoleon didn't answer. "You fear the cost," the entity continued. This time Napoleon spoke. Every pact extracts a price. Even kings understand this. The hooded figure tilted its head, a gesture that was neither human nor animal. "Do you wish to withdraw?" Napoleon looked down at the map, at France, at destiny, at the storm circling his future. He clenched his jaw. "No, I will not withdraw." The figure's presence expanded, filling the room like a tide of cold. "The price you pay," it whispered, "will not be yours alone." Napoleon stiffened. "What do you mean?" The shadow turned its face toward the map, toward Europe. "An empire built through darkness demands collateral." The candles extinguished at once, plunging the room into blackness. Then the voice spoke its next words with terrifying clarity. "Your bloodline." Napoleon's breath froze. His bloodline. He had no heirs, only rumours, possibilities, names whispered in salons. But an empire, his empire, required descendants. "You will take them?" Napoleon asked quietly. The figure shook its head. "No, Something far worse. Napoleon gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. Explain. The darkness thickened, swirling like ink in water, and the voice spoke the prophecy that would haunt Europe for centuries. Your empire will rise like a star and fall like a curse. Your name will echo across time, greater in death than in life. But your lineage will wander the world as ghosts, never ruling, never resting, never belonging. Napoleon inhaled sharply, fury flaring. A curse? A consequence, the being corrected, of power stolen from the abyss. For a long moment the room was silent. Then Napoleon whispered, "I accept." The candles reignited, normal yellow flames as if nothing had occurred. But the pact was sealed deeper now, more binding, more lethal. And Europe would soon feel its first tremor. The following months were a whirlwind of strategy, war, and whispers. Napoleon moved through Europe like a shadow of inevitability, a man guided by intellect sharpened beyond mortal comprehension. Yet for all the brilliance he displayed on the battlefield, there was an edge to his victories now, an almost cruel perfection, as though some unseen architect ensured nothing could go wrong. And for those who observed closely, the unnatural patterns became impossible to ignore. Every Austrian manoeuvre anticipated, every Prussian advance countered before it began, every Italian ally aligned before they themselves understood allegiance. Napoleon's generals spoke in hushed tones about the emperor's luck, a term that began to sound less like fortune and more like the workings of a force beyond human reason. Yet the victories came at a cost. Troop numbers mysteriously dwindled, supplies vanished without explanation, and more than one courier carrying critical intelligence was found dead under circumstances that could not be rationally explained. The men who served him closest whispered of a presence that stalked the camps, never seen, never spoken to, but always felt, an oppressive weight that seemed to measure the cost of each conquest. Meanwhile, Talleyrand was consumed by his own fears. He had seen the Shadow's power firsthand. He had witnessed the Whispering Map's pulse in the dead of night, felt the oppressive presence fill Napoleon's chambers, and heard the prophecy that the dark force demanded a toll from the emperor's bloodline. He had tried to warn others, old aristocrats, diplomats, even clerics, but no one could reconcile their understanding of politics with something so monstrous, so impossible. They dismissed him. Madness, they said. Yet Talleyrand knew the truth. Power granted through the shadow was never free. Every triumph, every empire forged by this force exacted a price, and this price would not be limited to Napoleon alone. Napoleon's obsession with relics and symbols intensified. He began collecting items from every corner of Europe: crowns, rings, ceremonial swords, fragments of ancient manuscripts. Each object he claimed, each artifact he studied, he placed carefully in the Tuileries, not for show, but as instruments in a ritual of alignment. The shadow did not merely observe, it communicated through these relics, guiding his decisions, nudging armies along paths even the emperor himself could not see. One evening, as the spring sun dipped behind Paris, Napoleon summoned Talleyrand to the chambers above the Tuileries. The room was unusually dark, the curtains drawn tight, candles flickering as if in anticipation of an unseen presence. On the table lay an ornate sceptre, rumoured to have belonged to a long-forgotten French king. Napoleon gestured to it. "This," he said quietly, "is not a relic. It is a key, and soon I will need you to understand why." Talleyrand hesitated. He knew the significance of the Dark Force's symbols carved along the staff. He had seen them in the Whispering Map, in the obsidian disc, in manuscripts meant to warn rulers away from such pacts. The sceptre was not a tool of power. It was a conduit, and conduits, when misused, could demand blood. Napoleon turned his gaze toward him, eyes cold, unwavering, almost inhuman. "You must prepare," Napoleon continued. "Soon the world will see the full measure of my plan. Every alliance, every battle, every victory, directed, perfected." "And the cost?" Talleyrand asked, his voice trembling. Napoleon smiled faintly. Not the charm of a ruler, but the quiet certainty of a man who had already walked through darkness. "The cost will come," he said. "But I will endure. France will endure. The shadow ensures it." Outside, Paris moved on. Citizens cheered at parades, applauded military drills, and celebrated victories that would shape the continent. No one suspected that their emperor's triumphs were not merely the result of strategy or genius, but of a pact with a force as old as Europe itself. In quiet corridors, courtiers whispered of Napoleon's unearthly poise, of the cold clarity in his eyes, of the strange way shadows seemed to bend toward him, even in broad daylight. The rumours were dismissed as exaggeration, tales to titillate salons. But Talleyrand, alone in his study, documented everything. Every shadow that lingered too long, every artifact Napoleon handled, every unexplained death of a courier, a soldier, or a minor minister. Every unnatural alignment of luck, weather, and timing that seemed to favour the emperor, and he began to draw a conclusion that chilled him to the bone. Napoleon's ambition was no longer his own. It was the will of something older, darker, and infinitely patient. And every man, woman, and nation that crossed his path was now a piece in a game whose rules no mortal could fully comprehend. Europe was no longer merely at war with France. It was at war with a force that had taken human form and called itself Napoleon. By 1805, the world had begun to feel the true scope of Napoleon's ascendancy, and the unnatural hand that guided him. The Battle of Austerlitz loomed, and with it the culmination of years of preparation, manipulation, and secret consultation, with forces that no human should ever witness. Napoleon's armies moved like clockwork, every regiment positioned, every flanking manoeuvre anticipated. Yet those who served him closely whispered that the precision of these victories was no longer entirely human. The generals who once debated tactics found themselves following orders that seemed improvised, reckless even, but somehow perfectly effective. Every move carved through the Austrians and Russians with impossible precision, as if invisible hands rearranged the battlefield to suit the emperor's will. Some of the men whispered that Napoleon had changed, that he no longer slept like a man, ate like a man, or even breathed like one. And in the dead of night, when the campfires died down, those with sensitive eyes swore they could see a tall, flickering shadow moving among the tents, its edges undulating like smoke, its presence bending reality itself. It was the ninth shadow, and it waited. Talleyrand, ever vigilant, watched from a distance. While most of Europe focused on the growing strength of France, he focused on its source. The relics, the artifacts, the obsidian disc, the whispering map, they all pointed to the same conclusion. Napoleon had been bound to a power older than kings, older than empires. He had been given strategic insight, intuition, and near-prescient timing. But the cost was already being tallied. Talleyrand's studies had revealed patterns. Generals who opposed Napoleon too stubbornly often disappeared mysteriously. Couriers carrying sensitive messages were sometimes found dead, sometimes vanished without trace. Soldiers under extreme duress were occasionally found alive in situations that should have killed them, save for some strange, unseen force guiding them away from harm. And the shadow always lingered, unseen but undeniable. In the weeks leading to Austerlitz, Napoleon became increasingly withdrawn. Even Josephine noticed his absence, physical, emotional, spiritual. He spent hours alone, eyes fixed on the whispering map, murmuring to the darkness as if receiving counsel from someone or something beyond this world. One night she approached him cautiously. "Napoleon," she whispered, placing a hand on his arm, I feel you slipping from us. From me. What is happening to you?" He turned to her, his eyes reflecting a strange, unearthly light. "I am becoming what I must be, Josephine. I am guided by the will of forces you cannot comprehend. France will be protected. Europe will bend, and we will endure." Josephine recoiled, her hands trembling. The man she had married, the brilliant, impassioned Napoleon, seemed to be replaced by something colder, sharper, and infinitely more calculating. Something that obeyed rules older than dynasties and codes of honour. Guided. By what? She asked, fear creeping into her voice. Napoleon did not answer. Instead, he returned to the map, tracing a line from Vienna to the Danube. Outside, the wind howled against the Tuileries windows, as though echoing a chorus of distant, spectral voices. When the French army finally reached the plains of Austerlitz, a strange fog lingered at dawn. Soldiers murmured about its unnatural density. Officers whispered that it smelled of something metallic, ancient and alive. Even the cannons seemed to tremble in anticipation, as if aware of the gravity of what was about to unfold. Napoleon's presence on the battlefield was magnetic, almost hypnotic. He moved among the troops, issuing orders, inspiring them, guiding them. But it was more than inspiration. It was direction. Not merely tactical, but fundamental. A force beyond human comprehension bent the very outcome of events to his will. And in the moments before the battle commenced, witnesses swore they saw shadows stretching unnaturally along the ridges of the hills, dancing and writhing, sometimes forming shapes vaguely humanoid, other times like serpentine tendrils crawling across the earth. Napoleon did not flinch. He had grown accustomed to their presence. He even seemed to draw strength from them, stepping into the mist with a resolve that surpassed human understanding. When the battle erupted, it was as if history itself tilted. The Austrian and Russian lines faltered inexplicably. Maneuvers that should have failed succeeded perfectly. Cannon fire seemed guided by invisible hands, striking precise points on enemy formations. The French troops fought with unerring unity, their morale unnaturally high, and Napoleon, at the centre of it all, remained calm, almost serene. Not a man commanding an army, but a man walking in synchrony with a force that controlled the outcome before it even began. By midday, Austerlitz was decisively won. The Allies retreated, defeated not only by military genius, but by a power that no human could perceive or resist. Napoleon stood amidst the aftermath, surveying the battlefield. Talleyrand, arriving later, noted the unnatural clarity in his eyes, the way his shadow did not align with the sun. Something in the Emperor had fundamentally changed. He was no longer merely Napoleon Bonaparte, he was a vessel, and Europe had just witnessed the beginning of a force that would shape history far beyond mortal reckoning. The victory at Austerlitz sent shockwaves through Europe. Monarchs and ministers alike reeled from the swiftness and precision of Napoleon's triumph, unable to comprehend how an army, fatigued and outnumbered, could rout two great empires in a single morning. Diplomats speculated endlessly, attributing it to cunning strategy, luck, or the genius of a single man. But Talleyrand, observing from the shadows, knew better. The Emperor's success was not a product of strategy alone. It was the work of the ninth shadow, the ancient force that had bound itself to Napoleon months, even years before. And with each victory, the shadow's influence grew stronger, more tangible, more insidious. Napoleon returned to Paris in triumph, yet he did not celebrate. The streets filled with cheering crowds, banners waving, orchestras playing, yet inside the Tuileries he remained alone, pacing before the whispering map. He traced lines across Europe as if tracing veins in a body, murmuring in a language only the shadow understood. The air in the room shifted, thickened, and shimmered as if charged with electricity. Candles flickered, bending toward him rather than upward. The temperature dropped, yet Napoleon felt only focus, clarity, and purpose. "This is only the beginning," he whispered to the darkness. "Austria is broken. Russia humiliated. The path is clear." The shadow stirred. A silent ripple across the room, shaping the shadows on the walls into forms both humanoid and monstrous. It did not speak, yet its presence communicated the unspoken truth, that the victories won were merely the currency of a debt not yet fully claimed. Talleyrand had little time to act. Europe was crumbling under Napoleon's ascent. The Habsburgs were desperate, the Tsar of Russia paranoid, and the British crown manoeuvring with every ounce of guile it possessed. Yet none of them suspected the true source of Napoleon's unassailable advantage. Talleyrand gathered a clandestine network of advisors, occultists, exiled scholars, and members of long-forgotten European orders whose knowledge of ancient rituals had been passed down in secrecy. They studied every manuscript, every artifact Napoleon had touched, every subtle anomaly in his behaviour. Their conclusion was horrifying. Napoleon was no longer a mere mortal commanding an army. He had become a vessel for a power beyond understanding, a conduit through which the shadow reshaped the very fabric of Europe. And the shadow's demands were already becoming evident. In the weeks after Austerlitz, mysterious deaths began to cluster around Napoleon. Couriers carrying confidential messages vanished without a trace. Advisors and generals who had opposed him subtly or openly often found themselves removed from positions of influence, or worse. Some were discovered days later, lifeless in the woods, their faces frozen in expressions of unexplainable terror. Even the whispering map reflected these events, its lines quivering whenever Napoleon or the shadow moved. Europe itself seemed to respond to the pact. Borders shifted subtly, rivers overflowed at inconvenient moments, and storms seemed to target strategic regions. Nature, it appeared, had begun to obey the Ninth Shadow's will. Napoleon, however, remained indifferent to human suffering. To him, these were mere instruments, like pieces on a chessboard. And Europe, its kings, its emperors, its common people, were pawns in a game that only he and the Shadow truly understood. But Talleyrand had noticed a pattern that troubled him. The Shadow was not acting solely to empower Napoleon. It was shaping him, refining him, moulding him into something inhuman. His eyes, once filled with charisma and warmth, now reflected only certainty and calculation. He smiled less, laughed less, and spent increasingly long hours conversing with the darkness alone. Josephine noticed too. She often caught him staring at the night sky, murmuring as if responding to voices beyond comprehension. Attempts to reach him emotionally were met with cold detachment. Even his body began to betray a strange unnaturalness. Servants remarked that he appeared taller in the morning than at night. His shadow often failed to align with the light. Occasionally a candle's flame would bend toward him as though drawn by magnetism. The shadow, Talleyrand realized, was not content with guiding Napoleon. It was claiming him. Then came the first warning from beyond the battlefield. The Emperor's dreams. Napoleon had long been a man of vivid dreams, but these were different. They were not mere visions or premonitions of war. They were visitations, haunting the hours of sleep with dark landscapes, cities crumbling under unnatural storms, and whispers in a language older than Latin. In these dreams, the shadow spoke directly. It promised power, dominance, victory. It promised empire. But each promise carried a subtle threat. Every conquest would demand a sacrifice, every crown a debt, every life a payment. Napoleon awoke sweating, heart pounding, yet with the same certainty that had carried him through Austerlitz. "I can pay the price," he said aloud, speaking to the darkness alone. "I can take it all." And the shadow whispered its approval, a sound that seemed to echo from the very walls of the Tuileries. Europe, unknowing, braced itself. For what had begun as ambition had become something far darker, a march of destiny directed by forces unseen, a web spun across the continent in which even the mightiest rulers were helpless. Napoleon's empire was no longer just France's, it was a vessel for the Ninth Shadow, and the world would soon discover the full consequences of such power. As Napoleon's influence grew, so too did the web of fear surrounding him. Europe's courts whispered of the emperor's unnatural precision, but only a few knew the truth. Napoleon was no longer alone in his ambition. He was guided, shaped by the Ninth Shadow. Every decision, every maneuver, every victory was now a thread woven with the will of something older than kings, older than empires, older than France itself. Yet the Shadow's influence was not a simple guide. It was a master. It demanded more than obedience. It demanded transformation. Napoleon's body and mind began to reflect this change. His posture became rigid, unnervingly precise, as if his very bones were being arranged to reflect the order of unseen forces. His voice gained an unnatural cadence, cold and hypnotic, drawing loyalty not from admiration, but from the irresistible compulsion of the shadow. Soldiers who met his gaze felt a strange magnetic obedience, their doubts evaporating before a power they could not define. Even Josephine could feel it. The woman who had once held his heart now recoiled from the distance that had crept between them. At night she sometimes heard him whispering to the darkness alone, murmurs in an ancient tongue that made her shiver, yet she dared not ask for translation. In the palaces and backrooms of Europe the reaction was far less subtle. Monarchs sensed an anomaly. Austria's Emperor Francis trembled at the thought of facing Napoleon again. Tsar Alexander, proud and stubborn, felt unease gnaw at him, even in moments of apparent advantage. The British, ever wary, interpreted it as brilliance, but intelligence reports, often dismissed, spoke of movements impossible for a human mind to calculate. And in secret, Talleyrand studied the signs. The shadow was no longer content with guiding Napoleon. It was testing Europe, measuring its response, shaping events in subtle but catastrophic ways. Natural disasters aligned inconveniently with campaigns. Supply lines failed under circumstances that could not be explained. Entire armies seemed to act against themselves in moments of extreme misfortune. It was as though history itself had begun to bend in obedience to a force imperceptible yet absolute. Talleyrand feared what the next step might be. Napoleon, oblivious to doubt, pressed forward. The whispers from the ninth shadow were constant now. In dreams, in solitude, even across the battlefields the presence guided him toward victory, but always with a price. He was aware of it, yet he accepted it willingly. "The empire," he whispered to the darkness one night, "is worth the cost." And the shadow responded, not in words, but in sensation. A shiver across his skin, a tightening of the air, a pulse that echoed through his chest like a second heartbeat. Every act of conquest exacted its toll. Couriers disappeared, advisors died unexpectedly, generals fell in battle under circumstances that defied probability. And yet Napoleon continued to rise, unstoppable, a living instrument of a power that no human hand could resist. By mid-1806 the shadow's presence was no longer subtle. Observers noted Napoleon's eyes, sharp and unnatural, reflecting a light that seemed to come from within. Shadows in the palace bent unnaturally toward him. Candles flickered when he entered rooms, but not randomly. They leaned, almost as if bowing. Rumours of the supernatural began to circulate quietly in Paris, whispered by servants and courtiers alike, that the emperor no longer slept, that he communicated with spirits, that his victories were guided by forces beyond comprehension. Even the whispering map reacted to these changes. Symbols shifted with each decision he made. Borders elongated, armies moved, alliances rearranged themselves, not in strategy alone, but as if reality itself bent to the shadow's will. Napoleon no longer merely conquered land. He conquered probability, bending the outcomes of battle, diplomacy, and history itself. But the shadow's guidance came with a subtle menace. Talleyrand noticed it first, an edge in Napoleon's decisions that hinted at ruthlessness beyond calculation. Collateral casualties were not merely tolerated, they seemed required, even welcomed. Cities burned not for necessity, but as statements. Enemies were humiliated, not just defeated, and always, behind the brilliance, was a pulse of darkness, a warning that every conquest carried a debt beyond the reach of mortals. One night Talleyrand recorded in secret, "Napoleon is no longer the master of France. He is the master of a shadow, and this shadow will demand its due." The warning would prove prophetic. In distant castles, old noble families began to sense the pattern. They remembered whispers of the umbre custodes, of emissaries that walked through history in the guise of mortals, bending the fates of kingdoms. Letters were sent secretly between Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg, warning of something unnatural at the heart of France. But words alone could not convey the scale of the threat. Napoleon's rise was no longer merely political, it was apocalyptic in its precision. Europe was awakening to a force that no army could stop, no king could challenge, and no alliance could restrain. And at the centre of it all stood Napoleon, guided by the ninth shadow, unaware that each step forward bound him closer to a price that would consume more than just his ambitions. By 1807, Napoleon's dominion over Europe had become nearly absolute. Kingdoms had fallen, treaties had bent to his will, and the map of the continent seemed to shift with his movements. Yet for all his triumphs, a shadow lingered, literally. Soldiers whispered of unnatural figures moving among their ranks, glimpses of dark forms on the battlefield, and sudden, inexplicable storms that seemed to follow the emperor. Talleyrand, always watching, recorded these events meticulously. He had become convinced that Napoleon's victories were no longer human achievements. They were orchestrated by the ninth shadow, an ancient, insidious intelligence using the emperor as a vessel to reshape Europe. And yet there was something even more troubling. Napoleon's reliance on the shadow was increasing. He consulted it openly in private chambers, whispering to the darkness for advice on campaigns, diplomacy, and even personal matters. It was no longer a guide, but a partner, one whose motives remained inscrutable. Josephine, increasingly disturbed, confronted him one evening in their private suite at the Tuileries. "Napoleon," she said, her voice trembling, "you are changing. "I do not recognize you. Who are you speaking to in the dark? What are you asking?" He did not immediately answer. His gaze was fixed on the whispering map, its pale glow illuminating his face with an unnatural light. "I am securing France," he replied finally, voice calm, unwavering. "I am securing destiny. The rest is nothing." Josephine recoiled. She had loved him once for his fire, his passion, his humanity. Now she felt the cold certainty of a man who no longer belonged to the world of mortals. "And the cost?" she whispered. Napoleon turned to her, and for a brief moment, the warmth of the man she had loved flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone. "The cost," he said quietly, "will be paid, but not today." The shadow stirred behind him, silent and patient, as if approving his words. Meanwhile, Talleyrand worked tirelessly to warn Europe. He reached out to foreign courts, sending clandestine letters detailing the unnatural phenomena surrounding Napoleon. Some dismissed him outright, calling his warnings madness or exaggeration. Others hesitated, sensing the truth but unsure how to confront it. For all their skepticism, the pattern was undeniable. Reports of strange weather, failed offensives, and inexplicable victories spread across the continent. Troops reported seeing figures that should not exist. Soldiers vanished without trace, and intelligence networks faltered as if sabotaged by an invisible hand. Napoleon's rise was no longer political. It was supernatural. The shadow's influence extended even to the emperor's personal life. He became increasingly isolated, withdrawing from human contact. Meals alone, conversations with Josephine sparse, hours spent in silent consultation with the darkness. The people around him began to notice the change, a magnetic, terrifying presence that demanded obedience and inspired fear. Yet Napoleon's genius reached unprecedented heights. Campaigns were executed with machine-like precision, victories stacked upon victories, and treaties signed under the shadow of inevitable domination. Europe seemed powerless, its kings and generals unable to predict, let alone counter, his moves. The whispering map, now fully attuned to the shadow's will, pulsed with every decision. Borders shifted, armies advanced or retreated as if on invisible tracks, and Europe's rulers moved as though puppets on an unseen string. Then came the first real test of the Emperor's pact. In the spring of 1807, the Russian Tsar prepared a counter-offensive designed to crush Napoleon's forces. Reports indicated strong positions, prepared defences, and substantial manpower. Yet when the French approached, a strange fog enveloped the battlefield. Communications faltered. Russian lines faltered inexplicably. The French, following Napoleon's precise but unorthodox orders, executed manoeuvres that defied reason yet succeeded flawlessly. After the battle, witnesses spoke in hushed tones. Entire divisions had vanished from view, only to reappear in perfect positions for decisive strikes. Cannons fired with impossible accuracy. Troops swore they felt an invisible hand guiding their movements, steering them toward victory. Talleyrand, observing from afar, understood fully. The shadow was not merely advising Napoleon. It was bending reality itself. Europe had entered a new era, one in which mortal armies and kingdoms were subordinate to a force older and more intelligent than any human mind could grasp. And Napoleon, the Emperor of France, was its chosen vessel. The full scope of the consequences, however, had yet to be revealed. By 1808, the grip of the shadow over Napoleon was absolute. No longer merely a guide, it had merged with his will, bending his thoughts, instincts and actions to a purpose that was both his own and entirely alien. Europe trembled not simply before a man, but before a power that used a man as its vessel. Napoleon moved like a spectre across the continent. Armies obeyed with unnatural synchronization. Fortresses fell before they were even properly defended. Diplomats whispered of the emperor's foresight, a supernatural clarity that left even the most cunning monarchs bewildered. Yet the cost, the toll of the pact, grew heavier with each conquest. In quiet moments, alone in the Tuileries, Napoleon felt it, the debt the shadow demanded. It did not speak of gold, land, or titles. It spoke of life, blood, and lineage. The prophecy whispered long ago in the secret vaults of the Midnight Parliament now came alive. His empire could be vast, unstoppable, eternal, but his bloodline would pay the ultimate price. The descendants of Napoleon, if any survived, would wander without power, without claim, and without rest, their fates entwined with the shadow's dark will. Napoleon's eyes, once warm with ambition, now glowed with a cold, calculating light. He walked through Paris as though the city itself were an extension of his being, aware of every alley, every building, every soul. Soldiers and citizens alike felt the shift. He was no longer fully human. The shadow flowed through him like blood, a river of invisible authority. Across Europe, murmurs of unnatural occurrences intensified. Entire units reported seeing shadows that moved independently of light sources. Couriers vanished without trace. Political rivals experienced sudden illness, accident, or misfortune, inexplicable yet perfectly timed. Nature itself seemed to bend, obeying the rhythm of the Emperor's commands. Talleyrand, increasingly desperate, attempted one final warning. He travelled secretly across capitals, sending letters coded in ancient runes, warning rulers that Napoleon was no mere man, that he was a vessel for something far older, far darker. Some dismissed him as paranoid. Others shivered quietly in agreement, realizing that no human strategy could explain Napoleon's unerring victories. Yet Europe did nothing. Pride, disbelief, and political inertia allowed the shadow to tighten its grip. Then came the moment that would mark the turning point, the Peninsular Campaign. Spain, resisting Napoleon's expansion, became a crucible in which the emperor's reliance on the shadow collided with the limits of human will. Guerrilla attacks, insurgencies, and harsh terrain tested even his preternatural foresight. Yet through the guidance of the shadow, Napoleon's forces advanced. Victories were won, cities taken, and treaties forced upon reluctant kings, but always with a lingering sense of unease. The shadow whispered warnings in the dead of night. It reminded Napoleon that every conquest demanded payment, every victory claimed its due. France prospered, but the personal toll mounted. Advisors disappeared, soldiers vanished, families grieved. And yet Napoleon, intoxicated by the power, pressed forward relentlessly. In the quiet hours, Talleyrand reflected on the enormity of what had occurred. The ninth shadow had chosen Napoleon not merely to conquer, but to change the course of history itself. A man whose intellect had already shaped nations had become the instrument of an intelligence older than Europe, and with each victory, each manipulated battle, each forced treaty, the shadow's influence expanded. It did not bend to Napoleon. He bent to it, willingly, with the conviction that destiny justified the cost. Europe, unsuspecting and unprepared, had entered an era where mortal rules no longer applied. Kingdoms, armies, and kings were pieces in a game whose design was invisible and incomprehensible. Napoleon stood alone before the whispering map one final night. His victories had reshaped the continent, yet the shadow's presence reminded him that his empire was not truly his own. Every move he had made, every battle he had won, had been orchestrated with a cost he could not evade. He traced his finger across Europe's contours: Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, Moscow. All were points in a network, a lattice of power and influence that now stretched across the land. And the shadow whispered, "The world bends to your hand, but your lineage pays the price. The debt is eternal, and all who follow you are bound to the consequences." Napoleon clenched his fist. There was no fear, only determination. "I will endure," he said softly, to the darkness, to the shadow, to history itself. "I will endure, and France will endure." And in that moment, the ninth shadow withdrew slightly, leaving Napoleon standing in the flickering candlelight, a conqueror not merely of nations, but of the very fabric of reality. Europe would remember his victories. They would celebrate his genius. They would whisper his name in awe. But the price, hidden in shadows, would unfold across generations. The Dark Pact had been sealed, and nothing in Europe would ever be the same.